Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this meetup where John Yablonski, I hope I pronounced it right, we were actually practicing the name just before going online. But John is going to share his knowledge on how to understand the psychology of design. And I'm Tina Øvad, and I'll be your host this afternoon. And also a good evening or good afternoon to you behind the screens. I know there's a lot of people participating from all over the world. So I'll just say good morning, good afternoon, and good night. And then I think I have you all covered. So we have John with us today, and John is a multidisciplinary designer, speaker, writer, and digital creator based in Detroit Metro. And his passion is for designing digital tools that empower people in order to achieve their goals. And he's also the author of the book, The Laws of UX, and is a huge advocate for using psychology to design better products and services. And he's here today, so I'm very pleased by that. So the agenda, as always, is that when I'm done with all the practicality, John will start his talk. You can ask questions in the QA section here in Zoom, and then we'll go through some of the questions at the end of the session. As always, we are recording everything, and we'll share it via mail during the next couple of days, maybe in the beginning of next week. And we'll also include John's slides in that mail. And then I just briefly want to talk about Preely, because we are the ones hosting this meetup, and Preely is a self-service platform for unmoderated remote user testing. And you can also host your own test panel at the platform. So if that's something you might be interested in, you are very welcome to reach out to us, and then we can see if we can do some magic together. So I think that was all the practical stuff from my side. So I'll just give the word and the screen to you, John, and then take it away.
All right. Let's see here. Okay. Thanks for having me. My name's John, and I'm excited to share something that I'm so incredibly passionate about, and that's this intersection of psychology and design. So today I'll be going through using psychology to design better products and services. A little bit about me. I'm a digital product designer, multidisciplinary speaker, writer, digital creator. And really my focus is creating digital products that help people achieve their goals. Traditionally, my focus has always been on websites and mobile applications, and really, you know, that kind of experience has molded and traveled with me throughout different industries throughout my career. So everything from designing HMI systems for brands like Cadillac, to supersonic routing for the aerospace industry, to interactive installations. All these kind of, you know, industries have shared a very common thread in terms of how design might work within that space. Now, as a designer, I think what interests me the most is this kind of, you know, it's not necessarily landscaping or urban planning, but really kind of the path that people take in terms of how they perceive and process information. And then in turn, use that information to inform their decisions and build an understanding and achieve their goals. So I think that psychology can really help guide us in deciphering the underlying mental model, mental blueprint that we share as human beings. And understanding this blueprint can really, I think, help designers build more intuitive, human-centered products and services. But that space is kind of hard to navigate. There's a lot of information. And I think that there's a few key psychology concepts that are particularly valuable for designers that we'll talk about and cover today. So I think that we're just really fortunate to have this wealth of psychology, this parallel discipline that we can draw from and learn from as designers. So, you know, when I became very interested in this intersection of psychology and design, it was really hard to find really good information out there on the web. You know, it would be, you know, academic research. It was really kind of dense and hard to kind of see how it might apply to user experience design, or it was the opposite. It was marketing related things that really kind of only scratched the surface. So that was the big motivation for me behind creating this website, Laws of UX, and really kind of trying to surface up this information in a way that was really catered to user experience designers and kind of very succinct in how it delivers that information and how it might be applied to design. And I carried this over into a book that Tina mentioned, Laws of UX, Using Psychology to Design Better Products and Services. And really, the premise of this book was that I believe that an understanding of psychology, specifically the psychology behind how users behave and interact with digital interfaces, is maybe the most important non-design skill that a designer can actually have. So even the most elegant designs can fail if it's forcing users to conform to the design rather than working with the grain or working with this blueprint of how humans perceive and process the world around us. So this book is a practical guide that really kind of explains how you can apply these key principles in psychology to build better products and services that are more intuitive and human-centered. And I think it's important to understand the underlying fundamentals that influence our discipline. Once again, kind of coming over an influence from this parallel field of psychology. So today I want to kind of talk about some very select principles. And this is kind of a rundown of all the chapters that are in my book. But what we're going to do is kind of focus in on some very key ideas here, some very key principles. We won't have time to cover all of them, but I'd love to kind of touch on some of these very kind of critical ones that I've found particularly useful throughout my career. All right, let's get started. So the first one is Jacob's Law. So users spend most of their time on other sites. And what this means is that they prefer your site to work the same as all the sites that they already know. Now, this was coined by Jacob Nielsen in 2000. And what he was really referring to at the time was the premier technology, the internet, the web. But it doesn't take long. It's not hard to kind of zoom out and understand how this could easily be applied to really any digital product or any digital experience. And the reason for that is because of the underlying psychology concept known as a mental model. So a mental model is actually what we think we know about a system, especially how it works. It's how we use knowledge from past experiences when we interact with something new. You could think of it as a representation of how something works. We can't keep all the details of the world in our brain, so we use these simplified models to really kind of understand complex things and to arrange them in organizable chunks within our mind. So mental models are valuable for designers because when we can match our designs to the user's mental model, we can really kind of improve their user experience and enable them to easily transfer knowledge that they had from one product or experience to the one that you have designed without the need to first take the time to understand how it works. You know, they can kind of they already get it intuitively. So let's take a look at some examples. One of my favorite examples is this image on the left, which happens to be a control panel. And you can see here that it's adorned with all the kind of controls that you would imagine, toggles and switches and buttons. And people prior to the internet were very familiar with how these kind of things work. Now, if you compare that to the image on the right, these are form controls. Now, you can see the direct correlation between the physical toggles and switches and buttons and their digital equivalents on the web. And that's because the designers of the early form controls that we all are familiar with these days were really kind of borrowing from that physical equivalent, right? They were carrying over mental models that we already had formed around how those things function, how they look, and applying that, grafting that onto the web. And in the process, made this new form factor of the internet that much easier to kind of understand for new users because they kind of already were familiar with the physical controls in our physical world. So this is an example of bringing physical associations into the digital space. Now, of course, coming from that automotive background, it would be remiss if I didn't have an automotive example. This happens to come from a Mercedes-Benz, and it's a seat control And you could imagine here that these various kind of buttons that make up the seat control could have been arranged in a row. In the automotive industry, that's called a row bank. But what the designers of this vehicle decided to do instead was to map the controls into the shape of a seat. Now, why is this valuable? This is valuable because we already have a mental model of what a seat looks like and how it works. And by mapping the buttons of the seat into the shape of the seat, it's just instantly intuitive what part of the seat we might be controlling. So this is yet another example of kind of taking, building upon mental models that already exist to make a design that much more intuitive. And this next example comes from e-commerce. Now this happens to be from Etsy, but really it could be any e-commerce platform. And the reason for that is because they all follow very similar patterns and conventions. Now, typically any e-commerce website you land on, it's going to have a product tile featuring the product, of course. It's going to have the title of the product, maybe a price, rating. You're going to have a search very prominently at the top. You're going to have a shopping cart where your items will go once you've decided to purchase them. Even the icon itself of a shopping cart is borrowed from the physical equivalent, grocery stores, where we put items into our shopping cart. So these are examples of using mental models to allow for the UI to just get out of the way, allow for the interface to kind of recede. And it's just intuitive how this thing works because we've already built up a mental model around what we do here and how they work. And we can carry that to every e-commerce website we go. And as a result, the interface gets out of the way and we can more easily do what we came here to do to begin with, which is to purchase product. Now, unfortunately, mental models can also go awry. There can be problems, and that's known as mental model discordance. So when something that's familiar to us suddenly changes, for example, this is a good time. This is a kind of common example when discordance will happen. So take, for example, Snapchat. They did a big redesign several years ago now, and when they rolled out this major redesign, they rolled it out literally overnight. So this app in which users were already intimately familiar with all the features and where things were from a information architecture standpoint, it had suddenly and abruptly changed overnight. And this disrupted the mental model that people had formed around how Snapchat works. And as a result, a lot of unhappy users ended up abandoning Snapchat and ended up going to competitors like Instagram, never to return to Snapchat. So this is an example of when mental models, once they've built up, can actually, you can introduce discord into that if you suddenly change things. And this would really go for any kind of design that we're doing. Now, on the other hand, we can mitigate that mental discordance when we allow users to kind of build upon or form a new mental model over time. Using redesigns is another example. This happens to come from YouTube, and Google, as the parent company of YouTube, has a really good track record of understanding how to do this really effectively. So with YouTube's redesign, they introduced the updates gradually and then allowed for users to opt out and go back to the previous experience over time. And what this gave users an opportunity to do is to really kind of build up that new mental model over time and get used to this kind of new experience. And so that mitigated that discordance that would have occurred otherwise. And eventually, of course, they switched over when they had a critical mass adoption. They switched over to the new YouTube, and it's, you know, the one that we're all familiar with these days. So this is a good example of kind of building upon pre-existing mental models and introducing changes in a way that doesn't introduce that discordance that I just spoke about. Now, let's do a recap of Jacob's Law. First, users will transfer expectations they've built around one familiar product or experience and transfer that over to one that appears similar whenever whenever it makes sense. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of how people might look at the thing you're designing based on things that it seems similar to that they've probably already experienced before. The other thing is that we can leverage these existing mental models to create superior user experiences in which users can really focus on their task at hand rather than learning new kind of models or kind of learning how your site works specifically, right? They can kind of use that prior knowledge, and it helps make this new experience that much more intuitive. And finally, when we are making these kind of changes, we can minimize discord by really empowering users to either, use a familiar experience, and allow for them to opt out and go back to that, the thing that's more familiar to them, or gradually introduce changes over time that allows for them to kind of gradually comfortably build up that mental model that already exists. Now, one of the things I think is really important to do here is when we're kind of tying psychology and user experience design together, is to also connect that to, UX methodologies or artifacts that are really valuable for us, right? And I think in the case of Jacob's Law, user personas are really powerful. So they're user personas, if you're not familiar, they're a fictional representation of users whose characteristics and goals represent that of a larger group of users. Now, I believe that the frame of reference that personas can help define is incredibly valuable. And the reason for that is it helps us get out of our self-referential thinking and focus on the needs and the goals of the user, which is actually more useful when we're prioritizing new features. So instead of saying, I as a user think this and that, we can disconnect from that because we aren't actually the users, right? We can kind of step away and understand things from this kind of like broader group that we've kind of captured in a persona to help kind of break out of that contextual, that self-referential context as a team. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is the peak-in rule. And this happens to be one of my personal favorites. So the peak-in rule states that people judge an experience largely based on how they felt at its peak and at its end, rather than the total sum or average of every moment. Now, the underlying psychology concept associated with the peak-in rule is actually cognitive bias. Now, cognitive bias are systematic errors of thinking or rationality and judgment that really influence our perception of the world and affect our decision-making ability. You can think of them like shortcuts that increase our efficiency by enabling us to make quick decisions without the need to thoroughly analyze every situation. So scientists actually estimate that approximately 95% of our cognition happens below the threshold of conscious thought. What does that mean? That means for the most part, the shortcuts that our mind takes are making the overwhelming majority of our decisions without us even being conscious of that. And it's a good thing because it helps us focus on the important stuff without sweating the small things every day. Now, sometimes, however, these can lead to errors in reasoning, judgment, or memory. And this is what we refer to as cognitive bias. Now, the origins of cognitive bias, and by the way, I think it's really important to connect these concepts to their origins. And in the case of cognitive bias, we look at this study, which is called When More Pain is Preferred to Less, Adding a Better End. Now, this was conducted by Daniel Kahneman and associates, where they basically split participants into two distinct kind of trials. Trial 1 involved participants submerging their hand in 14 degrees Celsius water for 60 seconds. Now, the second group did the same thing. They stuck their hands in 14 degrees Celsius water for 60 seconds, but then stuck their hands in slightly warmer water, 15 degrees Celsius, for an additional 30 seconds. Now, the conclusion that the researchers came to after interviewing participants that had undergone these trials was really surprising, because it was actually the second group, trial 2, that actually looked back more preferably on the experiment overall. They were the ones that were more likely to repeat it, or to say that it was kind of favorable. It wasn't that bad. They rated it more favorably. And the conclusion that the researchers came to was that it was actually because of the end, how that trial 2 ended, that kind of shaped their overall kind of memory of the experience overall. Now, the same researchers conducted this same kind of study in different ways, one of which was like a colonoscopy, and they left the kind of surgical tools inside the patient a little bit longer and kind of extracted those kind of more gradually. So it was a lot less pain. And those participants in the study actually thought back to their colonoscopy more favorably as well, because it ended less painfully than if the doctors had just suddenly extracted their tools. So this is yet another example of how the way an experience can end can actually shape the memory of the experience overall. Now, let's take a look at a few examples. Moving into the digital space, one of my favorites when it comes to the peak end rule is MailChimp. So MailChimp, if for those that aren't aware, it's a newsletter service, and they help you build newsletters and manage campaigns. And with newsletters, there's no takebacks. It's basically an email. And this can lead to a lot of stress because you're worried about things like typos, inaccurate information. So the moment that you're about to hit the send button can be incredibly stressful. And the designers at MailChimp know this. So they introduce a little bit of brand humor to kind of take the edge off. Here you can see Freddie, the chimp, their mascot, kind of becoming visibly stressed out the longer you wait to hit that send button. He starts to kind of sweat and shake a little bit. And then eventually when you do hit the send now button, he celebrates with you. You can actually click his hand, and his hand will get redder and redder the more you click it. So you're kind of celebrating with Freddie. And it's a nice little Easter egg that kind of, ends this kind of journey for the customer in a very kind of delightful way. Now, of course, MailChimp's not the only one that thinks about this a lot. Uber's another really good example. And several years back, Uber was looking at their application, their mobile app, and considering where the most drop-off was happening. Where was the pain points for their customers? And it turned out it was actually that waiting from the time you ordered your ride to the time that the ride is actually arrived at your location. That was the most painful part for customers. And it was the area in which customers were most likely to abandon their trip altogether. So Uber looked at this and kind of realized that there was a few things that they could do to potentially change this. One was idleness aversion. So this is our tendency toward justifiable busyness. And if they introduce things like animation so that you could discover things about your driver and their drive history and their vehicle, and really just kind of make discovering this information a little bit kind of fun, it would actually kind of help. Also, the goal gradient effect, which is actually our tendency when we approach a goal to kind of speed up the closer we get to it. And then operational transparency, what's happening underneath the hood, kind of demystifying this process that's happening between the driver and the rider. So in their app, they made things like progress bars a lot more kind of apparent. The kind of distance from the driver to the rider, very visible. And then once again, discovering this information just kind of more delightful and fun. They were able to significantly reduce that post request cancellation and really kind of improve the experience overall. So they took what was a peak moment during the experience, the wait, peak in this case would be a negative peak, and then be able to kind of bring that down to improve the overall experience. Now, once again, kind of tying these psychology concepts to UX methods or artifacts, I think in the case of peak end rule, journey mapping is incredibly invaluable because it's really a great way to visualize how people use a product or service through this narrative of accomplishing a specific task or a specific goal. It's a very linear visual format for seeing the journey step by step that users have to kind of go through. And all of a sudden, because of that journey, the emotional peaks become very apparent. So you can layer on qualitative information that kind of gives context to when things are particularly painful or when things are particularly kind of delightful. And you can kind of lean into those, or you could fix them when they're kind of particularly kind of painful. And then you also have that context leading up all the way to the end. What was the end of the experience like? So that you can really kind of shape and improve the experience overall by kind of honing in on these key moments and then the end. So let's recap the peak end rule. First is that we need to pay close attention to the most intense points and the final moments or the end of a user journey. We need to identify the moments in which your product is the most helpful, the most valuable, or the most entertaining, and really kind of lean into that and design to delight the end user. That can also kind of change the overall experience for the customer and their memory of that. And finally, it's important to remember that people have a tendency to recall negative experiences more vividly than the positive ones. So by addressing those first, we can really kind of help change that dynamic and how they remember the experience overall by kind of really focusing in on the negative peaks in particular. All right, the next one I want to talk about is Hick's law. Hick's law states that the time it takes to make a decision increases with the number and the complexity of the choices available. Now, the underlying psychology concept that is associated with Hick's law is that known as cognitive load. And cognitive load generally refers to the amount of working memory resources that we have at our disposal. Now, if we're talking about interaction design or digital design, it's referring to the amount of mental resources needed to understand and then interact with an interface. I like to kind of communicate Hick's law in these two simple diagrams. So the first is reaction time, which is proportionate to the amount of options available. So here you can see that it's a kind of a curved kind of path that's proportional to, you know, the amount of stuff that you have to process or decisions you have to kind of make, and then the time that it takes to make a decision. And then the second part is working memory, which you can kind of think as our like computer RAM, right? So working memory is really our temporary storage that we use to kind of put information that's useful in terms of whatever goal that we're trying to achieve at that moment. You can think of it as kind of like a scratch pad. And much like computer RAM, we have a very finite amount of slots available to occupy it with information. So the more information that's in there, the slower we'll kind of get. And the more that we continue to add, the more we'll start to lose on the other end. So it's kind of like, you know, just like how you need to kind of close applications to speed up your computer every once in a while, it's the same concept with working memory. Now, if you think about that and you apply that to design, we're going to first look at the physical space. And one of my favorite examples from the physical space is remotes. So these are, of course, universal remotes. Thankfully, these are becoming quickly a thing of the past, but you can see here that these kind of remotes are just absolutely adorned end to end with controls or stimuli. So each one of these is buttons that we have to kind of make a conscious decision to select in terms of whatever task that we're trying to do. And you can imagine a lot of cognitive load is accrued just trying to simply find the button you're looking for here. Even if you're intimately familiar with these remotes, it can kind of take some time before you find exactly what you're looking for, which has actually led to one of my favorite things on the internet. This is grandparents' remotes. You can find them all over. And this is where, you know, sons and daughters or grandkids have you know, taped off all the unnecessary controls or buttons of this remote to improve the experience, to improve the decision time for their grandparents in terms of finding the button that they're most likely looking for. So this is a good example of like DIY user experience improvement by just simply taping off and removing options that then in turn improve the overall user experience. Now, if you compare that to the controls that we're much more familiar with these days, smart controls, you can see that the options are dramatically reduced, right? So here's an Apple TV remote, way less options, and as a result, much faster decision time to kind of select the control you're looking for. Now, let's move into the digital space and think about Hick's Law. And I think one of the first places that this is a very apparent kind of concept that's very applicable is onboarding. Now, one of my favorite onboarding experience ever has come from Slack. Because when you drop in, you're not presented with a modal that takes you through a fully featured application and you're clicking through and not reading anything. But here, what they do is they drop you into a very simplified version of Slack. And you have one option, and that's to interface with Slackbot. Now, this is a sandbox environment. Slackbot's not going to tell anybody what you're saying to it. What you're doing here is you're learning the key feature of the application in a very safe, non-judgmental environment, right? And it's only once you've done that that you can start to kind of, you get revealed to you additional features in Slack. So this is an example of like building, it mirrors the way people learn new things in general. We progressively build upon pre-existing knowledge in layers. Now, if you think about this, and let's move into another context, the Google homepage. Now, the Google homepage has remained unchanged since pretty much its entire existence, you know, minus a few minor UI tweaks here and there. It's basically been the same thing. And the reason for that is because they're optimizing around reducing cognitive load by removing all potential friction to get started with this massive thing, which is searching all of the internet, right? If you think about that, you're searching all the internet and all you need to do is simply type in a keyword or simply one word, you know, and you're really kind of at that point unlocking all these options. So this is an example of removing that friction and reducing that cognitive load to get you into the experience and gradually kind of revealing more complexity. And it's only once you've entered that keyword, you get all these additional options in terms of, you know, different ways that you can filter your search or, you know, different results that have come through this. So you're kind of gradually or progressively kind of, you know, experiencing this complexity over time as opposed to all up front. And as a result, it's reducing that cognitive load that you would experience at the beginning. So let's do a quick review of Hick's Law. The first is that we can minimize choices when the response times are critical to increasing decision time. We can also do things like break complex tasks into smaller steps in order to really decrease the cognitive load overall. We can provide recommendations to really avoid overwhelming users and highlight recommended options that kind of nudge them in the right direction and really help them to kind of speed up with that decision time. And we can use techniques like progressive onboarding to really minimize the cognitive load for new users. Now, finally, this is a big caveat. We need to be careful when it comes to Hick's Law because the answer is not always with simplification. In fact, simplification can actually lead to abstraction. Now, when we simplify to the point of abstraction, it's no longer clear what actions are available, what the next steps are, or where we can find specific information. I'll give you an example. Let's just take iconography. Now, it turns out not all iconography is internationally recognized, right? Some things might mean one thing to one culture and something totally different to another culture. And that's why it's important to always accompany icons with text labels that kind of describe what it is, so that users have a bit of a clue as to what this might mean or what it might do if you interact with it. And what you're doing as a result is removing any ambiguity and reducing the cognitive load that users would have to kind of take on by kind of guessing or thinking harder about what those icons might actually mean. And of course, once again, kind of tying these concepts to actual UX methodologies or artifacts. I think in the case of Hick's law, card sorting is great, because card sorting gives us a way to kind of figure out how topics should be organized according to people's actual mental models by having those participants organize topics within groups that make the most sense to them. So it's all about identifying the information architecture that's in their head and getting that out in a way that aligns with how people think about those categories and the items that live under them. So I remember the first time I discovered card sorting as an exercise, and it was this aha moment, because, you know, take, for example, building sitemaps or complex navigations where you're guessing at what the kind of most common sense structure should be. You can really kind of take a step back and kind of co-create that information architecture with your actual users, and as a result, make it that much more intuitive for them. Okay, so I've spent a lot of time talking about this intersection of psychology and design, and I think it's critical to also talk about the ethical responsibility and power that comes with that knowledge. So it's critical that we consider how products and services actually have the potential to undermine the goals of the people using them. And the first step in making more responsible design decisions is to actually acknowledge and understand the ways in which the human mind is susceptible to persuasive technology and how behavior can actually be shaped by technology. I talk about this in my book, it kind of linked, but I think it all begins with behavioral psychology in this particular device known as the operant conditioning chamber, also known as the Skinner box. So it was a compartment that was kind of devised by B.F. Skinner, the psychologist, to really understand how people behave certain ways and if that behavior can actually be shaped. Now, he was using animals like rats and pigeons to conduct his experiments on. And what he would do is actually stimulate them or trigger via a stimulate, like a light, trigger response, like pull a lever. And as a result of pulling a lever in this entrapment, they would get food or water, so a reward. And it was this kind of like cycle that he used to kind of shape the behavior of animals. There was a few interesting things he found. If he varied the amount of reward that they got every time they were stimulated by a light and then trained to pull the lever, it would actually lead to more compulsive behavior. So variation of rewards and timing led to compulsion. Now, if you think about this and you kind of apply that to the digital context, unfortunately, we have a lot of examples of intermittent variable rewards, right? I think the pull down pattern in Twitter is a very kind of blatant example of this, right? We're kind of pulling down this feed in order to get new items. And that might be a post that we're tagged in. It might be comments on a post that we've posted ourselves. The idea here, though, is that it's different every time. And this kind of like very easy action can actually kind of become compulsive as well. What other ways might technology shape our behavior in ways that we wouldn't normally, do? I think another example of this is autoplay. So if you go to streaming services like Netlify or products like YouTube that are auto playing the next video, this infinite loop can actually kind of really, maximize our time in that site by removing all possible friction, in this case, playing the next video through an explicit action. But it's very kind of easy to, without the need for the user to make a conscious decision to load more content or play that next video, Companies can actually ensure that passive consumption on their site or apps continue uninterrupted. Ads are typically interspersed within this looping content so that the time on site means more ads view, right? And it's a model that's significantly more effective in generating revenue for the company, but not necessarily kind of the most beneficial for the end user, because this is, of course, something that they might most likely wouldn't normally be doing. Technology shaping their behavior. Another example of this is the ubiquitous like button, which you can find really on any social media platform these days. Now, like most features, this began with good intentions and it quickly led to shaping behavior in a negative way. So it turns out human beings were inherently social creatures, and we have a drive to fulfill our core needs for a sense of self-worth and integrity, and it extends beyond our lives on social media, but we go to social media to seek rewards. And it turns out that like each one of these likes is a little hit of dopamine, and the most vulnerable within our societies, like preteens or teenagers that are still kind of developing their own personal identity, can be particularly susceptible to this kind of drive, right? So this drive to belong and social affirmation can really kind of shape their behavior in interesting ways that they probably wouldn't typically do. Why do I bring all this up? Well, I think as an industry, as a tech industry, we've moved fast, and we've actually moved too fast to really consider the implications, right? So in the process, we've broken a lot of things. And the impact is still kind of unknown because the research always kind of lags behind. Luckily, it's beginning to catch up. And we're starting to see things kind of happen over and over again. So this organizational focus shifting over time is a pretty common thing. I love this graph by Jesse Weaver, where he kind of describes this. Companies typically start, or design teams start, with solving human problems, right? And then over time, it might be acquisition, it might be growth. They start to kind of shift those priorities over to more business-centered goals. And things like shareholder satisfaction become the priority over human value. And the way we measure success is even starts to change in these kind of dynamics. So things like daily active users or monthly active users, time on page, time on site, these are all measurements of what users are doing, right? They're quantitative measurements, but none of this is really metrics that reflect the success for the actual user. How is it impacting or improving their lives? Quantitative data can tell us lots of things. It can tell us like how quickly people are performing tasks, what they're looking at, how they're interacting within a system. But it's not telling us why, right? It's not telling us why users are behaving a certain way or how the product is actually impacting their lives. And I think that it's important that designers take accountability for the technology that we help create and ensure that it respects people's time, attention, and overall well-being. So no longer is moving fast and breaking things really an acceptable means of building technology. Instead, we really need to slow down and be intentional with the technology that we create and consider how it's actually impacting people's lives. All right. So you might be asking yourself, John, this is all great, but how do we actually use this information? How do we leverage it and apply it to our practice as designers? And in that regard, I think that principles are incredibly valuable. So designers can internalize and apply psychological principles by codifying them into their design process. Now, one of my favorite things with the Laws of UX project overall is seeing these posters that I made available for each kind of concept free, that people could print out and put in their space. And seeing images of these posters in offices all around the world is super promising to me, because it's telling me that designers are incorporating these concepts into their work. It's framing how they describe the decisions that they're making. And they're really kind of, it's this kind of, reintroduction of a lot of these psychological concepts into the work that we do as user experience designers. But it turns out there's a more effective way of doing this as well, and that's through design principles. So design principles are a set of guidelines that represent the priorities and the goals of the design team and serve as a foundation for reasoning and decision-making. So design principles help to frame up how a team approaches a problem and what it values as a team, right? As a team grows, the amount of decisions need to be made increases proportionally. And these principles can really serve as a North Star for guiding the values that embody what good design looks like for that particular team. Now, all of a sudden, these gatekeepers are no longer a bottleneck, as the team has kind of codified the shared understanding of what success looks like in the context of shared values and shared goals. I'll give you an example of this. This is just a kind of generic principle, but it's doing a few things. One, it's stating the principle, clarity over abundance of choice. Now, one of the things that this is doing that's immediately making it more effective is it's avoiding irrefutable truism with this even or mechanism, right? We value clarity even over abundance of choice. Abundance of choice could actually be an equally valid kind of goal, right? But what we're saying here is that we value clarity over abundance of choice. So we have an actionable principle, and now we have a rule associated with this. So in the case of this principle, it's Hick's law, which we know means that the time it takes to make a decision increases with the number and the complexity of choices available. So now you have the beginnings of what's a framework, right? You have a principle, you have a law that reinforce that, and now you need tactical ways to follow this, right? So one way to do this would be, in order to achieve this, we must, and then have tactical examples of how you can follow this principle. In the case of this kind of generic principle that I'm using here, we can limit choices to no more than 3 items at a time, or we can provide brief explanations when useful that are clear and no more than 80 characters. So once again, I believe that understanding psychology, specifically the psychology behind how users behave and interact with digital interfaces, is perhaps the single most most valuable non-design skill that designers can actually have, right? Because even the most elegant designs can fail if it forces users to conform to the design or the technology, rather than kind of working with this blueprint that we all share as human beings and how we perceive and process the world around us. And I truly believe that it's important to understand the underlying fundamentals that really influence our discipline and come over from this parallel discipline of psychology. So thank you so much for letting me share today. And let's get into some Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I'm just like you preaching to the choir, like at my end for sure. I think it's so interesting. And I like the idea of these design principles where you actually set it in the scene of the team or the organization, because I think we have a tendency to be like, okay, we want to have these overall principles that we can apply everywhere and not take it in and actually try to apply it to what we are actually working with. So actually going through them like that, I think that's awesome. So keep the questions popping. I can see Ellen she's very fond of mental models, and I am as well. And I actually have a question about that, because of course, one thing is to use the mental model people have for the design, but how are you actually assessing it? So what do you normally do? Because one thing is, of course, you have an idea that you're designing in this space, and then you go out and look into, okay, in this space, what type of products are they using? And then you start to deducing, okay, the mental model must be like this. But how do you do it like more in a detailed manner?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. And I think, I spend a lot of time talking about these concepts and principles, but I think that all of this is really in service of qualitative research, right? Talking to your actual users and asking them, how are they perceiving certain things? What tools or products or services do they use, and how do they kind of understand what's happening and really start to unearth that mental model and form a picture of it by talking to the people that you're designing for, and really kind of, you know, surfacing up insights from how they are perceiving, whether it's your design or designs that are similar. So yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, and it's really, it comes down to really just kind of talking with your users and spending that time getting to that qualitative insight.
Yeah, I think it's great. So I also have a question, that because of course now we're talking into this, and you have this like great book about these laws and so on. But if you actually wanted to dig more into this field of applying psychology to design, like, do you have any recommendation there? Of course, like read your book, but do you have any recommendations to courses or people to follow, or like where you can have inspiration for actually widen your horizon when it comes to psychology and design?
Oh, there's so many great places to kind of mention here. I think some that I found particularly just like staples in my everyday kind of reference. I would say definitely Nelson Norman Group. Everything that Don Norman or Jacob Nelson have written is fantastic. I think that I mentioned Daniel Kahneman. I think that his book Thinking Fast and Slow is an absolute kind of treasure trove of information for designers. And aside from that, I think it's a lot of, you know, despite, you know, it takes a lot of investment and time and kind of in being very diligent, but like at the academic research, you know, I've spent a lot of time on Google Scholar looking up academic research that pertains to user experience in some way. And there's a lot of just fantastic information throughout the years that are just super, super valuable for designers. You just have to kind of invest the time and the attention to kind of absorbing that information. But yeah, those are some of my absolute favorites. And you know, another one is like a Book Apart puts out some really great books. Some of my favorite is Designing for Emotion by Aaron Walter. I think that's a great book, and Designing for Cognitive Bias. Two really fantastic books that have a lot of overlap with psychology and design and kind of what we do as designers.
Yeah, so that's some good places to start. That's awesome. Keep some questions coming. I think they are a bit shy today, but it might be the heat wave. So but I think it's just great to have this emphasized that like the psychology is so important, and also the whole, like, we can't be human-centered without actually knowing things about psychology, right? And I think that's also like my experience, and I also of course also come from this topic, right? But it just makes this, like, your work so much easier when you know things about people and people in general as well, right?
Yeah.
So I'm definitely a huge believer in this as well. But I think people are a bit shy today, though.
That's okay.
So
you know, I'll speak to something that you just kind of made me think of, Tina. I think one of the things that I you know, oftentimes when I give this talk, I like to kind of reinforce this idea of like these concepts that I've shared today, these principles are not necessarily in lieu of user research. A lot of times they can kind of build up your intuition as a designer in terms of how you can understand and interpret the actions or the things that users are saying or doing, right? So it's kind of like building up that designer intuition, so that when you are conducting kind of usability research, or you're talking with your customers or users via interviews, or doing things like contextual inquiries, and you're sitting with them and watching them do stuff, it's really it's a lens for which you can kind of evaluate and understand what they're doing, right? Because I think one of the kind of beautiful things about psychology is that it's one of those things that it's hardwired in. A lot of these principles are based on things that we're just hardwired to do, right? And evolutionary wise, we've just kind of adapted with these kind of things. So these mechanisms for which we kind of perceive and process the world. So this is a really great lens for kind of understanding that, and it can kind of really help augment your user research.
Yeah, I'm completely agreeing with it. And I actually, there were a thing that triggered me because you talked a bit about this intuitive design as well. And when I teach, I always say there isn't a thing called intuitive design. There is understanding your users and understanding how people think, right? So also just being able to actually like know how people think, how people react, like also physically, for instance, right? How the memory is perceiving and so on, just does that instead of calling it, like we call it intuitive because that's how we sell it to our customers or to our stakeholders and so on. But it's actually nice to be able to pinpoint it's intuitive because of, and then X, Y, Z, right? Absolutely. So definitely a huge, huge thing. So a lot of people are saying very like big thank you to you, and I think you have a huge fan base here on our platform. So that's great to know. So I think we are actually almost running out of time. So I'll actually just stop now. But again, I think it was a very, very inspiring talk, John. And I think this is a very, very important topic when it comes to designing, that we know how people think, how they react, and like in general, the psychology behind people. So yeah, and again, we have recorded the whole talk, and you'll receive a recording of the talk within the next couple of days, maybe in the beginning of next week, and also a copy of John's slides as well. And again, you're very welcome to reach out to us here at Freely if you can see a match between our platform and what you're doing. Also talking into the mental model, cognitive load and so on, because this is actually some of the things that we address on the platform. So that's just great to know, I believe. And then also let us know if you have ideas for topics that you would like to hear in one of our meetups, or maybe like a speaker that you'd like to hear. Then we'll see what we can do. And that's actually how we got John on board. So please reach out if you have any ideas on that area. And then I think I'll just say thank you for now, and thank you for joining, and have a great day, and especially have a great day to you, John.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.